Welcome. I want to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Eugene Rhee, the current chair of the AUA Public Policy Council, and with two distinguished guests, but as well good friends, Dr. David Penson and Dr. Christopher Gonzalez. Many of you in this call also would recognize Dr. Kathy Shanley, the Chief Policy Officer for the AUA. The function of all this is to really kickstart a series of webcasts and podcasts to make it easy for you to listen to really garner your attention as far as understanding what we call the elusive art of advocacy, and how, in this case, people that you know have done a lot of lifetime work in this space, how they got started, and as well understand a little bit about Advocacy 101. So with that, you must understand as a listener that advocacy is part of the mission statement, along with research and education. Advocacy is one of the most important pillars for the AUA mission. And because public policy in everything that we do, it's critical to understand not only why advocacy matters, but also what role individuals play in the process. And so, as I've stated, I'm joined today by Dr. Gonzalez and Dr. Penson, and the AUA's Executive Vice President and Chief Public Policy Officer, Dr. Kathy Shanley, to talk about this important topic. So I'll ask our guests to further introduce themselves, starting with Kathy Shanley. Go ahead and introduce yourself, and then Dave and then Chris.
Yeah, hi everybody. Thanks for joining us today to hear a little bit more about our advocacy work at the AUA. I am the Executive Vice President of Policy and Advocacy, as Dr. Rhee said. I've been with the AUA for about 8 years, and I actually will be celebrating my 30th year in the association world in January. So thank you, and I'll turn it over to Dr. David Penson.
Thanks, Kathy. I'm David Penson. I'm the chair of urology at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. And I've been involved with the AUA now for it's going on 15 years or so in various roles. I started, it's a long story how I started, but the short version is I was the first public policy chair when public policy spun out of health policy, and served in that role till about 5 years ago or so. And then Chris Gonzalez took over, and I currently serve as the chair for science and quality for the AUA. Chris?
Chris Gonzalez. I am the chair of urology at Loyola in Maywood, Illinois, and I'm the former chair of public policy. I'm also the last vice chair of public policy when there was a vice chair. So I've been involved with this for about 8 years now, and I was vice chair to Dave's chair, so got a really good chance to understand the role and learn about it. It was an honor and a privilege to serve for the last 8 years. So appreciate you having me on this call.
Waiting for you, Eugene.
Oh, I'm sorry. All right. So, Eugene Rhee, current chair and the National Chief of Urology for the Permanente Federation, Kaiser Permanente. We're all friends here. We're going to go by first names here. Obviously, we've known each other for years. And speak up. I'll let you and you all speak to your piece here. When did advocacy really become relevant for you? When was that inflection point that you can recall as in urology?
I think I'm the oldest here, so I'll go first. I don't feel like the oldest gentleman, but and young lady, I think what I really got interested in this was when people were starting to look for value-based purchasing and trying to think of different ways to sort of pay for healthcare in the U.S. And for me, as someone who does research also and is also a clinician, but really wanted to sort of find ways to make a difference, it was clear to me that, whoever controlled the purse strings for reimbursement in healthcare controlled how we delivered healthcare. And so that was sort of the big lever to make change and improve things for patients. So I want to say about 2004, 2005, people were talking about pay for performance, which was the sort of, predecessor to what is now value-based purchasing. And I sort of got interested in that. And I felt a little bit at the time like I was Chicken Little at the AUA, saying, this is going to happen. This is going to happen. Guys and gals, we got to be on top of this. And it just kind of, cascaded from there. It did happen. So I seemed like I was pretty smart. I was just really lucky. And as I got more involved, it became really clear to me that while I really like doing research and I love seeing patients, that if you really wanted to make a difference, both for patients and also for urology and for the specialty, for the people who deliver urologic care, advocacy was really probably the best and certainly one of the most powerful avenues to do so, because you could really sort of influence the care of literally hundreds of thousands of people simply by a few lines of regulation or legislation. And so that really was what drove me into this, Gene.
Chris?
Yeah, I remember very distinctly. I was in 2000. I was just starting as an attending at Northwestern, and I was walking down the hallway, and Dr. Jack Grayhack was still on staff. And I remember him yelling down the hallway saying, "Hey, Gonzalez, I got to talk to you." So I went down and talked to him. He said, "The North Central section is looking for a health policy person, and I think you should consider that." And whenever he said anything, you just did it and said, "Yep, that sounds like a great idea, Dr. Grayhack." But he was very insightful. I mean, I think in those days, 20 years ago now, he was just talking a little bit about, he's like, there's all these things that get between the doctor and the patient relationship. There's all these different types of things, lawyers, pharma, all this type of stuff. And he goes, "Why don't you try and make an impact and get involved in this stuff? It might be something good, because I can see that as being a big thing." And he was 100% correct, as he normally always was. So I think that was kind of a nice little prime mover, because that really was not on my radar whatsoever. Once I got involved, I certainly met a lot of people. Obviously we'll talk a little bit more about how to get more involved, but through the Gallagher Scholarship and the first Jack, Bill Gees and Ron Kaufman's, who really had a good way of describing, where's the need and why are we here? Why are we doing these things? And I think my biggest thing is always, I just remember always seeing a chart or a graph where you've got two boxes, which are patient and doctor. And and that's the way it was 100 years ago. But now you got all these things that are interrupting that. It's like a huge flow chart now, everything in between the patient and the doctor. So our goal is to try and shrink that down, the relationship between the patient and the doctor, and help us get rid of those obstacles that make it so difficult for us to practice. And I think that's at least what Dr. Grayhack had mentioned, and that's something obviously that I've taken from that. So.
Thanks, Chris. For me, I think what got me started is more about leadership and understanding who I was. I think it goes for me earlier as high school and college, just being involved in student government, being advocates as students, even back way early. I'm curious to know if you both had, whether it was sports or academics or whatnot, if you saw you were sort of one of those people that liked to lead as far as that's concerned. I think that as I evolved into becoming a physician and a urologist, I started really understanding a lot more about trying to make a difference beyond, I get a lot of satisfaction towards the clinical realm. But sort of to Dave and Chris's point, you recognize that you have an ability to sort of craft and mold and shape something even bigger to help our specialty as far as that's concerned. And frankly, urology, I think everyone always gets asked, why did you choose urology? It's a lot about the people. And the people have been really just astoundingly creative, leaders in their own right, wonderful people in this specialty. And I love it so much that I think it got me motivated to be involved in a bigger realm in a position. I'm very humbled and deeply humbled by following in you guys' footsteps. Were you guys leaders in high school, college, that sort of thing? Reflecting back and what you were like? Dave is like, heck no.
Nope.
Late bloomer?
I don't know. I don't feel, I'll say, and it's not false modesty, I don't feel like I'm a natural leader. On the other hand, I am a firstborn child, and so that may have something to do with it. But I think that, when you get behind something that's important to you and it matters to other people, I think that naturally sort of puts you into some sort of driver's seat for what it's worth. But no, I was never the captain of any football team, anything like that. And it's not. I just feel like I said, you want to make a difference. That's what I was always told when I was a kid. My father would say, whatever you do, just leave the world a better place. And I I think a lot of us want to do that. I think when you're doing it right and other people sort of it resonates with other people, they naturally want to work with you. And if you end up being the leader, great. But I think people just want to do the right thing, and they're drawn to people who feel that way.
Chris?
Yeah, no, I think I agree with what David's saying. I think knowledge is power. And I think that if you really understand the problems, the issues, and where the soft points are, and really where the need is, I think that really goes a long way. And I think it is very attractive when you see somebody who's very engaged, and they're engaged for all the right reasons. It's easy to recruit people in those fashions. So we can do the high school things on the sports teams and all that. That's one thing. But I think really when you see somebody behind a cause and somebody who's really behind something that is worth fixing or worth revising, I think it's really easy to jump on board with people in those situations.
Right. I know that all three of us you had mentioned, Chris, we're all Gallagher Scholars with AUA. And that program personally was a big changing point for me. Tell us about your Gallagher experience, how that program specifically shaped you as an advocate.
Well,
Chris?
Yeah, for me, the Gallagher was extremely important. So, I was at the sectional level where I did a lot of things. I thought that was outstanding. A lot of good mentorship, and here's why we're doing these things. And really, at that point, you're kind of figuring out what do you want to do, or how do you want to contribute to the organization. So, the Gallagher Scholar, as I think I was the third or the fourth, I can't remember which one, but the bottom line is I saw the people that went in front of me who really enjoyed it. I admired the people that went in front of me. I thought they did a great job, and they said they had positive experiences. So I had to experience it for myself. And, when I did, I really felt it was very well organized. It was exposing me to all the different areas that we need to be exposed to. So you talk about reimbursement, you talk about coding, you talk about going to the JAC, your first JAC, and seeing what the political process is all about. It really left a really good taste in my mouth and really said, I want to continue to do this. I think that's great. And I think the other issue is right after the Gallagher is the organization trying to keep you involved. I mean, I think the main point is once people do these things, to keep them involved and keep the momentum going forward. And I really kind of saw where some of the soft points were. And I felt, everybody wants to try and make a difference or make an impact. And I felt I could make some kind of an impact or a contribution in that regard. So again, very strong mentorship surrounding the Gallagher, within the Gallagher, former Gallagher Scholars, and then also the people that I got to meet in the coding and reimbursement and the RUC and everything else. So again, very positive experience, and I think it's continued in that way. We've done a pretty good job of encouraging people to continue in that process. So, yeah,
so I'd echo that. I had both the blessing and the curse of being the first person to go through that program. And so it was sort of a tabula rasa. And the way I approached it was there were things I thought I knew something about. Not a lot, but there were a few. And there were things I knew nothing about. And for example, I really didn't have a good idea about coding and reimbursement. I didn't really understand how RVUs worked. And how that played into, how that played into reimbursement, and how that, and how Medicare used it. And so I kind of really approach it, which I think is different than the way it's done now. I think it's a broader experience now, which is better. But I really used it to learn about things I didn't know. I didn't know anything about. And for the most part, the lessons were really positive, and I mean that in a good way, not in a bad way. Like you go to this course at Brandeis, which I think they still do, which is about advocacy, which was great. And I met physicians from other specialties and policy experts. And then I learned, I said most of the lessons are positive. I learned a lot from negative lessons, like Chris has heard me joke about this before. I never want to go back to the RUC again. I found that to be it was not congruent with who and what I am. So that was a really important lesson because I realized how it worked, how important it was, and how I wasn't cut out to do it. And that's probably a really important lesson. So, but the nicest thing about the Gallagher program, I think, for the AUA, there's an expression which I steal from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation from some of their programs, which is building human capital. If you look at the people who've come out of that program, we've really developed a cadre of urologists young, and some of us are now middle-aged, who understand advocacy and understand policy and are able to work for the specialty and sort of influence things that help our patients and help our colleagues, which I think is great. I mean, it's just a terrific program.
Yeah, I mean, for beautifully said, both of you. I'll echo what you all said. Things I'll add though is that the Gallagher was the stepping off point, I think, for a whole host of opportunities. The AUA really understood that this kind of grew. The whole Grew Fellowship, a legislative opportunity for someone. The AUA leadership classes are also a stable, a racehorse, as I always say, that sort of advocacy is one thing that I think many people in the AUA leadership classes have seen and been involved in. And even the section leadership themselves have led into our advocacy with the AUA work. And finally, the staffers at the AUA. The thing I think with the Gallagher was I didn't realize what a machine advocacy was until I was exposed to the Gallagher and the extent of networking within Baltimore and the AUA and DC and the rest of the country. And I think that, the physician volunteers is one thing, but seasoned staffers and as well as the network that was grown, relationships that were grown, I think you can't replace sort of that commitment we all had as Gallagher scholars. And I appreciate the AUA continuing that legacy moving forward. In your opinion, moving forward, what role does advocacy play in the practice of urology? And I want to be specific, pre-COVID and post-COVID or otherwise. What role do you think that advocacy plays? Let's go with Dave and then go with Chris.
Yeah, I mean, advocacy is critical, and I don't think people appreciate it. You made a comment about the Gallagher Scholar, and you mentioned some of the other programs, and I think, one of the things that I think the AUA has been good about in exposing folks in the Young Leadership Program, as an example, and some of the other sort of the resident sections about where advocacy matters for us. In the end, as Chris alluded to, it's not just the doctor and the patient. There are all these other parties that bounce around in that relationship and affect our ability to deliver care and for patients to get care. And the only way for us to really leverage that is through avenues of advocacy. And it's not your classic, I'm just going to go visit my senator, I'm going to visit my congressman. It's advocating with government administrators. It's working with research agencies like the NIH. It's working at a state level, which the AUA does more and more. Really trying to get in there and talk to whether it's policymakers, whether it's legislators, so they understand what we do, because they don't understand what we do. And they often don't understand urologic disease. So if we don't go there and tell them, look, this is why, kidney stones are so awful for people who have them, and how it's hard for us to deliver care, or whether it's cancer or pediatric urology, they don't understand that they have this large spectrum of problems they deal with, and maybe they have one, legislative aid, and that person is responsible for the whole gamut of healthcare and public health. And when you go and you think about the regulatory bodies on top of it, you think, Medicare is an example. They get healthcare. They're delivering healthcare for every American over age 65. They don't really, and it's not their fault, nor should they be expected to understand the nuances of, urologic care for the elderly in this country. And so that's our job, to explain it to them and to point out to them ways that we can do it better with their help, things that are in our way, and also for us to respond to their needs, because they have real needs. So we don't learn it any other way. So to me, I think that's really the essence of why advocacy is so critical. Because if we don't go out there and explain it to these folks, they're not going to know it, right? And they're not going to be able to help us do the right thing for our patients.
In COVID times, post-COVID, Dave?
So first I have to be able to leave Nashville to answer that question, Dr. Rhee. So I'd like to hope that, one day in the future we'll get back to some sort of normal, maybe not the same. But I think also when you look at things now, as we go out there, look at the telehealth experience in the post-COVID era. I think that's a great example. And urology has been really good about leading, from the front with telehealth and advocating both at a national level and a state level. And they need to hear from providers who understand that. Clinicians who do that every day. But I hope that the relationships don't change that much post-COVID. If anything, I hope they lean on us a little more to understand how the virus has changed the way we're delivering urologic care and general health care to our patients, because it sort of has, right? But it's hard for me to guess. If you have a better guess, let me know, because I just have no idea.
Chris.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything Dave is saying. And I think advocacy, really as doctors, we're educators. That's what we are as doctors. And I think that getting the message out, to Dave's point, is extremely, extremely important of what we do, who we impact, and how many people we actually impact, and the importance of what we do. I know every group up there on the Hill is saying those things, and rightfully so, but I think we have a very strong message, and it's up to us to get it out there. And it's up to us to recruit other people to get it out there as well, too. I think advocacy means a lot of other things to me. It means patience. So we're not going to get a lot of victories. There's going to be a lot of negativity associated with it. There's going to be a lot of losses that we get and frustration, but we got to keep pushing forward. I also think advocacy is a slugfest, right? So it's going to be how many resources do you have versus your opponents or the people who are advocating for things opposite of what you're trying to advocate for. And, how do we communicate with them, and how do we communicate effectively with lawmakers, with people up on the Hill, with agency folks, as far as what we're trying to get across and the importance of what we're trying to get across. And I think those are all extremely important. So we talk about, well, you're going up there on the Hill and nothing's happening and it's the same old Washington, D.C. and everything. But that's not necessarily true. I think we've had some victories in the past, and SGR repeal we were a part of, IPAB repeal, the Eurotrauma bill being passed. So there are some real victories. And we're getting more and more victories now with some of the things we're doing with research advocacy as far as connecting the dots between NIH and NIDDK and getting our presence up there known. So I think the one thing I really enjoy and approve of with the AUA is that we do surveys of our members all the time, asking them what's important to you for advocacy. So we're not just from the hip up here. We're basically responding to what our members think is most important. And that's what we're trying to bring to lawmakers right now. So we're advocating for our membership. So what do we have? 300-400 docs that actually volunteer in some way, shape, or form. We want to keep recruiting those folks. And when we go to the summit and these kind of things and want to get involved, I think that's fantastic. So advocacy means a lot of things, but it means patience, not getting too down, and just being persevering through a lot of tough times.
Thanks, Chris. Public policy by definition is principles that are often unwritten, on which social laws are based. That's the definition of public policy. It's elusive. That's actually the title of this podcast. And I think what we're getting at is advocacy. It means different things for the three chairs here that you're hearing about. And I think that in my perspective, advocacy is trying to, represent urology, and specifically urology, in the different practices that are delivering the care, whether it's, as you will, in the academics, whether it's in independent practices, whether it's an employed group, managed care group, you name it, we're still all urologists under one roof. And the point is that the advocacy side is to really delve into what's important to urologists and their patients, to make sure that, as you all have stated, is make them help people understand who are lawmakers, policymakers. They don't necessarily have to be congressmen, as we all alluded to. They could be regulatory in nature, and they could be the general public. And the point is that these are things that we as human beings, we have social laws, and healthcare in terms of equity in how it's shared across our country. I think healthcare equity is something that no one is disagreeing we need to have that mission forward, sort of sense of urgency, particularly after the COVID. I think COVID, what it's bringing out is some of the great success stories of what our strengths of our healthcare system is, but as well as you can imagine, we've seen some complete weaknesses and heightened and amplified because of the fragmentation of our healthcare. So I think that, for us as leaders in this space and the advocacy work, we compel folks to work together to create an equity mission in the future. That's sort of how I have viewed it too in the practice of urology and advocacy. The AUA has built, it's obvious, we've had a strong policy framework over the years. Both of you, tell us a little bit about the framework, what you believe to be the responsibilities for, let's be specific of these areas. Let's talk about legislative and political affairs. Can you tell us a little about that framework that you're understanding now in your 4 years and 5 years of doing this job, what that means for you and the responsibilities and framework of legislative and political affairs? Chris, let's go with you and then Dave.
Yeah, I think legislative affairs extremely important, obviously, as they all are. But I think this is the group that does the best. It has the best opportunity to take what the membership feels is important and shape that into specific congressional asks, and really not to try and prioritize them, but bring them all, whether it's going to be 8 different legislative asks or 10 different legislative asks. But the bottom line is that we get the right wording to these things so we can put the resources that the AUA has behind it. We can incorporate this into the summit. We can incorporate this in, obviously, in many of our efforts with agencies as well. But I think that's going to be the biggest thing, is just trying to incorporate what our members need, responding to our members, let them know, hey, we heard you. Here's what we're going to do. And here are going to be our legislative asks, and refreshing that list every year. I think that's extremely, extremely important. So in my mind, that's, I think, the most important role of that particular committee.
Yeah.
Dave?
I mean, that's well put, Chris. I'd add a little bit, or maybe take a different tact, in that, legislative affairs specifically is one angle. And it's probably the highest profile angle because, you have laws, and, everyone sees when you get the repeal of SGR, as an example, through a bill, or we start pushing a bill for transparency for USPSTF, which, by the way, never got officially passed, but we got what we wanted, right? So legislative affairs, I think, is this sort of, everyone gets fixated on it, but it's like turning a battleship. It takes forever. But it's sort of, in many regards, the flagship of public policy in many regards, because it's the most high profile, I think, of the committees. But what's interesting about it, where I'm going with this, is that it's challenging because, as Chris alluded to, and you, Eugene, you mentioned, we have different practices and different people within the urology tent. You have employed physicians, employed by academic institutions, hospitals. You have large group practices. You have small practices. You have trainees. You have, advanced practice providers. And so everyone wants to go to legislative affairs and get their piece of legislation pushed forward. And so, as Chris alluded to, we have to think of the entire specialty. But I think it's sort of almost like an iceberg. We're seeing the tip of it, but what's going on below the ocean is just as important, if not more important, when I know we'll talk about like regulatory affairs and coding and reimbursement, which are not nearly as sexy, not as high profile, yet maybe just as influential. But I think when you ask about what's the framework there, that's sort of the sort of big ticket items, which I think are at the front and in the spotlights, but maybe not always the most important items,
Yeah. Well, so in the interest of time, I'm going to go. I have 4 more that I want to kind of go through because it's important in terms of what the Public Policy Council does. State advocacy. Let's go with state advocacy. Dave, what do you think? State advocacy, strong. Tell us about your framework in your mind.
So state advocacy is a really important and growing part of the AUA's portfolio. I mean, there's a long history which predates all of us. But the reality of it is that all politics are local, right? And policy and politics aren't the same thing, but policy is local too. So it's, we like to think this big federal politics legislation, but most of the decisions we're making and most of the most important decisions are at the state level. So AUA has doubled down in that area and has really grown that part of our portfolio because it's so important. What happens in California is so different than what happens in Illinois and so different than what happens in Tennessee. And so it's not a one size fits all. So I really like what's happened there. And that, we have Kathy, I think, in no small part to thank for that. She won't actually yell out and say anything, but Kathy's done a lot of the work there and has really driven that. And it's critical, and it's going to be more and more important as we go forward. And there are all sorts of examples that you can give, Eugene. Because California has been one of the most important sort of arenas where that's pulled out. Where we have had to come in as a national group to work with this on the state level to help our patients and our clinicians.
Right, Chris.
Yeah, I'd say probably in the last 18 months, it's been one of the most gratifying things is to work with the State Advocacy Committee and the really great things that they're doing. So I talked a little bit earlier about that. How do we stop all those forces from getting in between the patient and the doctor? And if you think about some of the things that were stopped at the state level, such as the intersex, the whole situation of trying to ban surgery for intersex and children with differences in development. I would say that that was a big deal because that was coming up state by state, and we were actually able to beat that down and keep it down for now. But again, constant surveillance, because at the end of the day, it's going to pop up again. I think things were sidetracked a little bit with the pandemic, but I think it's not the last we're going to hear of it. I also think other harmful things, such as trying to inhibit PSA screening, is another thing that in some states that we've actually been on the ground. We've been able to engage with a lot of really great folks and at the state level, and I think we've been able to get them involved as well too going forward. So I think it's been very gratifying to see, as Dave was saying, that grassroots level of where things basically start. And the thing is once something gets passed in 5, 6, 7 states, then all of a sudden, from a national perspective, hey, what's going on in those states? Cat's out of the bag, and we got a bigger problem on our hands. This way, we've been able to deal with it individually and knock down some of these threats immediately and have the playbook. We go from one state, from California, then we go to Iowa, then we go to Texas. We know what to do to make sure that our interests are protected and that our relationship with our patients and our ability to have conversations with our patients and do what that relationship between the doctor and the patient is not inhibited in any way, shape, or form. So.
Yeah, and what's gratifying right now that I'm seeing the fruits of the labor of early work is telehealth in the state advocacy work, state by state. Same thing with this COVID thing. The telehealth has really just moved forward in leaps and bounds, where each of the states are communicating, figuring out, hey, how do we do, how do we negotiate through licensure or reimbursement, payers, that sort of thing, as far as that's concerned. Research advocacy. Chris, talk about research advocacy, another pillar for us in our work at the AUA Public Policy Council.
Yeah, again, another one that's really, we're going to watch this take off in the next year to two. So we've got very motivated people on that particular committee. The way I look at it and what we've been able to do is just connect a lot of dots that need to be connected. So I thought one of the interesting examples would be, and we're working with District Policy, our lobbying group, who's been fantastic, and they've got connections as well. But if you think about it, we were asking about how do we get cancer survivorship funded? And in the past, what had happened is, well, the NIH would say, well, that's not our realm. And the NIDDK would say, that's not our realm. So what we were able to do is identify that miscommunication, able to connect the dots. So now we're going to talk to lawmakers about, hey, look, there is something real with cancer survivorship, and that affects all of us, from that perspective. So I think that's one good example. I think another thing is our representation. I think we were probably underrepresented, and with the NIDDK, we didn't have anybody in the strategic planning work group. And, we found out about that, went through the diplomatic process, found out who the players were. And actually now I think we've got somebody, at least one person on the strategic planning work group for the NIDDK, which just gives us representation because we got a lot of good people with a lot of good ideas in the House of Urology. And we want to have those people front and center. We're doing some really good research work. So I think research is just kind of finding out, letting them know what we do. We may not be able to get more of the pie, but maybe just increase the size of the pie, but maybe just increase the slice of the pie for urology and all the things that we do. So
great. Dave?
I don't have much to add to that. I think Chris hit the nail right on the head. It's a bit of a circular firing squad, right? There's X amount of research dollars, and if if rheumatology gets it, then nephrology doesn't, right? And so you got to be the squeaky wheel if you want the grease, and that's really what research advocacy becomes. But the point that Chris made, which is really critical, is there's a lot of sort of, when you go to the federal funding agencies, there's a lot of, oh, we don't do that, so-and-so does that. And you go to so-and-so and, oh, we don't do that, so-and-so does that. And so a big chunk of that is exactly what Chris mentioned, is pointing out to people, no one's doing it, guys. You guys are all thinking someone else is doing it and it needs to be done. So that's really a key part of our mission. And I think that's really built up since I was the public. It came after me is what I'm saying. So that's credit to you guys. And I really think it's really important. It's the only way we're going to be able to really improve the care for patients and get new therapeutics and make people better, is to, push research in that area. And that's how you do it.
So let's move on to payment policy, coding and reimbursement. Dave? And by the way, Norm Smith and Bill G will have their moment. Not as sexy. I think they're going to actually have, they have their own interpretation of this.
Money is definitely sexy for people. There's no two ways about it, But the funny thing is, no one realizes that's where, people don't realize that the coding and reimbursing piece, which is, not sexy for a lot of people, is where the dollars flow, and then they get interested. So it's frankly one of the oldest committees under public policy, maybe the oldest at this point. And in many regards, people don't understand it, but it's the most important, because it is how you get paid. And in the end, no margin, no mission, right? So it's really been an important part of the effort there, and it's representing us at the RUC. And I should say that the RUC is really a critical body that urology has to be represented in. And you mentioned Bill G. He was sort of our champion there forever and ever, and urology owes him a debt. And this is where I said before, where it's not sexy, because a lot of people don't realize how important he was for our specialty to ensure that we were adequately reimbursed for the good care we deliver. That group is just so integral to our success, and it is a bit sort of an arcane book of knowledge. Not everyone gets it, and not everyone likes it. I probably am the book categories, but the reality of it is that it's so critical to our mission, and it really and Chris can back me up in this. I know Eugene, you can as well. I mean, it really, as the public policy chair, it really is such a big part of your focus, and yet no one really, people don't appreciate it, because it really is sort of back office sort of stuff, but it's critical back office sort of stuff, right?
Chris?
Yeah, I can't overemphasize, the amount of respect and thanks that I give not only the AUA staff, who does an amazing job in this area, but to the RUC and to the CRC. I mean, I think Jonathan Rubenstein, Ron Kaufman are just, they're MVPs. They're most valuable players in this whole thing. And Bill G and Norm Smith, obviously. I think if the membership really, and if you ask most members who are not involved in public policy, they're going to say, yeah, don't they go up there and argue for money? But I think if they really understood the millions and millions of dollars that these individuals have saved us, just because of their knowledge and because of the respect that they have amongst their peers when they go up there in a very peer-reviewed situation, I think they would really open their eyes as to the importance of what they do. And I think that can't overemphasize just how important that is. And we say that all the time with the no margin, no mission. That's exactly right. But if we're losing reimbursement for the important things that we offer to patients, then that's a big, huge problem. And I think we talk about them a lot, but I think we can talk about them more, just about the importance of what they do. So I think it's a critical thing. And again, staff, the RUC, the CRC, just extremely important in our mission. And I think that they're well supported up there. And obviously, I've got nothing but great things to say about them.
Chris, let's talk science and quality. Finally, let's have you comment on that, and then Dave, obviously as a chair on science and quality, this is your baby. But Chris, why don't you talk about that?
Yeah, I think science and quality. I was vice chair on the patient QIPS, the KIPS committee. That's what it was actually. But so I was on that for a very, very short period of time. But I think science and quality, I think one of the first things I'd mentioned was knowledge is power. And I think what happens is that we are, from the advocacy perspective, we are coming to the Hill, we're coming to lawmakers, we're coming to agencies with facts. We're coming with a lot of really good facts. And I think the things that have been really hard work of putting these facts together. And I think Dave's been an integral part of that over the last several years, not just in his recent role. And I think that's like extremely, extremely important, is that many times people can have a message, but if you got a message with science behind it, I think that's extremely important. I think what we're trying to do as an organization, as far as building quality metrics, I think is obviously that's a slugfest as well too, because at first we were designing measures, went through all this work and money, and they weren't really recognized. But I think now a lot of the quality measures, a lot of the quality things that we were doing actually right now are going to be recognized. They're recognized on a daily basis with public policy when we do go to the Hill and talk to lawmakers about these things, with the guidelines. Incredibly powerful, the educational efforts that we're doing for AUA with these things. So again, we're saying everything's important because it is the bottom line, but I'll let Dave take it from there.
Yeah. So I guess I'm the old guy on this call, which really kind of bums me out. I certainly have the least amount of hair on this call, which is really sad. But in any event, I go back to a time when there was health policy and everything was under one umbrella. And you just look at how this has become such a focus for our organization and how critical it is. And that's why you have public policy and science and quality. And science and quality, which I'm chairing now, is on the one hand independent, on the other hand, interwoven with public policy. And in science and quality, you have the guidelines committee. So all of the great AUA guidelines are developing science, patient safety, which Chris alluded to, which does quality metrics and quality improvement. And again, it's very science-driven, I hope. And then finally, our data committee, which is oversees not just the AUA census, but importantly is the home of the AQUA Quality Registry. So we're collecting data on the quality of care, quality of urologic care in the United States. And why does any of that matter, right? How does that play into public policy and advocacy? It's all related. I like to think that the science and quality side generates the data that Chris alluded to. You can't go and make an argument for change without good, hard data to support what you're asking for. So in many regards, I think of science and quality as a sort of data generation organization, and the public policy side is this implementation and change-making organization, and they have to go hand in hand. It's been really fun to be involved in both, and I think that working together, that's how we do advocacy at the AUA. We don't just walk in there and say, "Oh, this is our opinion. We think this is important." We're able to walk in and say, we have data to show this. As we walk in with patients and say, these are our patients, they'll back us up on this. We have policy experts. We're able to push legislation. And by the way, there's another part of this as well, which is the AUA's Office of Education, which goes back and tries to inform our rank and file members about the science. So we're practicing in a way that's consistent for what we're asking for. I mean, it's a somewhat well-oiled machine, because it's gotten so big, but it's a wonderful machine because I do think it's effective, which is really cool, which is credit to, the folks on this call, you guys who have run public policy, the staff, to trainees, to rank and file members. We get a lot done as a group. And so that's, to me, where I see science and quality and public policy coming together.
So this is really important. It reminds me, it really was one of those milestones I'll never forget. Dave, when it was an AUA, and I think it was in San Diego, when the USPSTF had gone down to a grade D, do not recommend. You were the chair of public policy. It was extraordinary, the path and journey you took our group through. But kind of take us through, this is important, I think, for our listeners. this is sort of an amalgamation of science and quality, right, with advocacy work to in a long strategy to really get to some reform in USPSTF in regards to our PSA screening, which went to, which got upgraded. Can you take us briefly through?
Yeah, it's a great story.
Example.
It's a great story, and it is actually, you're right, Eugene, it's the perfect example of how this works, and it is a victory, and I'm proud of my small part in it too, but I think a lot of people played a big role in it. When you go back to 2012, the United States Preventive Services Task Force looked at prostate cancer screening and gave it a grade D. AUA had put out a guideline in 2009, which was a best practice panel, was not evidence-based, and that hurt us because we were really going and trying to advocate for screening based primarily on expert opinion, and people viewed us as biased. And then what you saw was, and there was learning on the part of the AUA. We made some missteps when it first came out. We maybe didn't message as well as we could have, frankly. But what I think we learned at the time was, we needed to have the long view. That was the first thing. It wasn't enough just to yell and scream and bury our take our ball and go home. We had to think about how can we make change, and we pushed a lot of different levers. First thing was we pushed the legislative lever, and we started to work with legislators on both sides of the aisle. That's an important part, to create a piece of legislation to say, it's not that the prostate cancer screening decision was necessarily wrong. It's just it wasn't inclusive of all the stakeholders. And let's push USPSTF and its funding agency, ARC, to be more inclusive and to include all the stakeholders. And that put some pressure to say, hey, listen, this is important. And then we came in with guidelines, and we redid our guideline. We created an evidence-based guideline that was a little bit more balanced, and pulled out the new data that had come out, and really took a different approach to PSA screening. And it was a change from our 2009 decision. We worked and pushed people, I think, from a data and quality, science and quality side, to say active surveillance is something we want to do. We need to change the equation here. And that worked also with the Office of Education. And then at the state level, when people started saying we're not going to cover PSA testing, state advocacy came in and got legislation passed at the state level to say, you're going to cover this discussion, and you're going to cover this if patients want this done. So you start to see all these different pieces being pushed. And then behind the scenes, again, with research advocacy and regulatory advocacy, AUA started talking to the United States Preventive Services Task Force on the old DL, as they say. And, you guys need to take another look at this. Yeah, we're going to take another look at this. Well, let's talk a little bit about why we think you need to look at this and these different, the things you maybe want to focus on. And when you take that, coupled with, frankly, legislative pressure, coupled with, new data coming out showing changes in diagnoses, you ultimately have what is effectively a public policy perfect storm, where we were able to make a change in a very collaborative, somewhat friendly way, where USPSTF, I think, moved from a D to a C, and urology and medical oncology recognized that the data were never going to support, mass population screening, but there was enough data to support individual discussions, and we've ended up, I think, in a really good place. It's a huge, huge victory, and it's a really great example of what happens when the machine works well. And there are other things going on now that I think are similar, around quality. I think telehealth is a good example of that too, where you see us pushing different levers in different parts of the AUA machine to help our providers, to help our patients, and to make urologic care better,
Fantastic. Yeah. We're running out of time, but before I go and say goodbye to my friends here, what's your advice to someone who's new to advocacy, wants to get involved, knowing what you all stalwarts experience, institutional knowledge, tell the listener how do you get started? What if you're just inkling of interest? What's your advice to these people that ask you? Chris, why don't you go with you, and then Dave, and then we'll close.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of that right now, and I would say I don't want people to feel shy to reach out to us.
Yes.
Reach out to Dave, reach out to me, reach out to you, reach out to the leaders in the field in these areas, and reach out and say, what can I do to get involved? I hear that all the time, and there's a lot of things you can do to get involved. We have the summit. Come to the summit. AUA PAC, you can go to that website and find out how to get involved in that, because that represents everything for all urologists. And I think there's something in that for everybody as far as what we're trying to get accomplished. But I think the biggest thing is the sectional level too, is the state level and the sectional level are extremely important. There's always opportunities. They're always looking for representatives on the committees at the state urology level and also within the sectional level. So again, talk to your program directors, talk to your chairs, and or talk to us. You know, the email, call, anything you want to do. So,
Dave?
Yeah, I obviously, you know, everything Chris said is spot on. I'll just add to the last part of what you said, Chris. I think getting involved locally is critical. The AUA is there to help people, and but I think it's daunting, particularly for younger folks who don't know the organization. And certainly, you know, you pick up the phone, you call people, you go to these meetings, and you'll find it's a welcoming place. And you know, we need all the help we can get. I don't know a better way to put it. So, you know, if you want to do the work, I assure you that the AUA wants your help, right? But the reality of it is that I really, if there's one thing I've learned in doing this over the years, and I think you guys will probably agree with me, at least to some degree, is that, you know, it all starts locally. It's a grassroots sort of thing. So getting involved in the section is really important. Understanding what's going on in your city, in your town, in your office, and knowing the players locally, you'll be more effective, number one. But number two, you'll bring a unique set of knowledge to the bigger table. I have no idea what happens in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. I'm picking that off the top of my head. But I have friends who practice out in Coeur d'Alene, as do you, Eugene. And those folks, you know, they can tell us what's going on, and we can learn from them. So I really think it's all about starting local and bringing that bit of local knowledge to the bigger table. You're really invaluable. But I'll add to what you said, Chris. I mean, yeah, just reach out. It's a friendly group of folks, and believe me, we're desperate for help. So if you want to help, well, we'll take it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, in close, I mean, we have more than 300 volunteer physicians that have been dedicated, but new faces, fresh new outlooks, starting local. Great advice. We have councils, committees that represent all 8 AUA sections. Speaking of local, be involved. Everything from Young Urologist Committee to women in urology to academic urology. These are opportunities that are very specific to people to be involved. And frankly, the summit that is coming up, I remind folks, the listeners, please register. It's free. And it's a unique way, very much like AUA Live, very engaging. We've made it that way through online abilities with 15 specialty societies. So it's a great way to get a taste of what the summit is without having to really spend some time off your practice. As far as that's concerned, please learn more at www.auanet.org/advocacy. Easy to remember, auanet.org/advocacy. And so with that, I'd like to thank Dr. Dave Penson, Dr. Chris Gonzalez, Kathy Shanley, and Wendy Islett for arranging this as a podcast that I hope you will all find valuable. Thank you again.
Thank you for listening to the AUA Inside Tract podcast, an official podcast of the American Urological Association. For more information, please visit auanet.org.